On today's Newsmakers, inside Hamas's atrocities, Israel's place in biblical prophecy, and the history that led to the current war, coming up. Welcome to Newsmakers, a show where we go behind the headlines every week to bring you interviews with pastors, entertainers, politicians, and other notable figures. On today's Newsmakers, we have a special episode. We're focusing in on Israel's battle with Hamas. First up, Pastor Greg Laurie will respond to those accusing Israel of occupying or colonizing land, and he'll explain the long history of anti-Semitism. Let's welcome Greg Laurie to Newsmakers. Greg Laurie, we have watched horrific events unfold in recent days in Israel with Hamas, a terrorist organization attacking the Jewish state. What has been going through your head and your heart as you've watched this?
Well, it's just been shocking and horrifying to see these images of civilians being targeted, women, elderly people, even elderly people who survived the Holocaust, and then children. Most recently hearing about babies that were murdered and decapitated. This is evil on another level. And I think, you think about people who came to Israel after World War II because they wanted a safe homeland to live in. And now this atrocity has happened. If the same thing happened in America, this would be like having 30,000 Americans murdered. But, when you have a partner, so-called, when we talk about trying to find a resolution and a two-state solution, I don't think it's really a two-state solution. I think realistically, from their enemy's perspective, it's more of a final solution, using the verbiage of the Nazis. Hitler described his desire to eradicate the Jewish people as the final solution. How can you negotiate with an enemy or with anyone who says you do not have the right to exist? And this is what these terrorist organizations say. This is what Iran, who's really sponsoring Hamas, has said repeatedly, publicly: we want to wipe Israel off the face of the map. So it's pretty hard to negotiate with that kind of mentality. But I think that the people of Israel were just shocked when this came. It wasn't a typical military attack. They came by land, they came by sea, they came on paragliders, killing people in that music festival and going into people's homes. And even when they were in their safe rooms, breaching those rooms, going in, killing them systematically, piling the bodies up. And, you see some of these images on the media, but they're usually blurred out. But on social media, you're seeing the graphic, real images. And this is atrocity. Well, we haven't seen this since the Nazis in World War II. And it's really horrific.
Absolutely. And as we're looking at this, we're always careful with a prophecy discussion. You and I have talked about this many times before, but when these events happen, people's minds go there and they wonder, how is this tied to prophecy? Is it tied to prophecy and what Scripture tells us? What do you say, especially about this circumstance, when people ask that question?
Okay, well, I'll say here's what is clearly tied to prophecy. The Jewish people in their homeland. The Bible's very clear in saying in the last days, the Jews would be scattered to the four corners of the earth, and they would be regathered. And this is, the Bible says many times in many passages, this would be a sign of the last days. Well, on May 14th, 1948, against all odds, on the heels of the Holocaust, the Jewish people returned to their homeland and they became a nation. They were attacked immediately, attacked later in the 73 Yom Kippur War. And this attack by Hamas was right near the anniversary of that, ironically. But they've survived these attacks. So Israel being in the land is a sign of the end times. The Bible also says that Jerusalem would be at the center of world conflict in the end times. This tiny little city, the name Jerusalem means city of peace. Yet more wars have been fought at her doorstep than any city in human history. So the city that's going to be at the center of end times events, it's not Moscow, it's not Washington, D.C. or Paris or London. No, it's Jerusalem. God said this hundreds of years ago. In fact, Zechariah says, I'll gather all nations together against Jerusalem, shall be a burdensome stone. And whenever you read about these threats from Iran and others, they always talk about, driving the Jews out and taking Jerusalem back. It always comes back to Jerusalem. So that's certainly a sign of these times. But then you read in Ezekiel 37 about a large force identified as Magog marching on Israel after they've returned to their homeland. So this event hasn't happened yet. Who is Magog? No one can say with absolute certainty, but many Bible scholars and prophecy experts believe Magog is Russia. I happen to believe that as well. So Magog or Russia will attack Israel. If it's not Russia, we know Magog will. But here's what we do know. One of the allies of Magog is Persia, which is the ancient name for modern Iran. So Iran is identified as an ally of Magog or Russia. Now, it's worth considering that Russia and Iran have come together in recent years and formed an alliance. The Iranians have provided the weaponized drones that have been used in the Ukraine war. So many other things are happening there as well in this alliance. And so clearly, I think Iran is behind Hamas. I think that's been pretty established. The Wall Street Journal did a deep dive into that. Even the Washington Post has agreed with that assessment, though our government doesn't seem to be so sure about this in particular. But I think it's very clear that Iran is behind Hamas. So could this be a chain of events that would lead to that? I would not say it would be, but you could rule out that it could be. But, I do believe these are interesting developments happening in our world right now, and specifically in Israel.
Well, and these are the countries that we're talking about, right? I mean, Russia's been in the news for a long time now. For a while, we've been focusing on it. Iran has been in the news and lots of other countries. And so it does pique, your interest as you look at these events. At the end of the day, we know we need to be praying for Israel, as you were saying before. And Greg Laurie, as always, appreciate your time taking us through all of this today.
Thanks, Billy. Good to be with you.
There's certainly a lot of history there, and it helps us understand the context of what is happening right now on the ground in the Middle East. Up next, the reporter who broke the horrific story about Israeli babies being massacred will speak out. This is Newsmakers on the CBN News Channel. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newsmakers on the CBN News Channel. Our next guest is Nicole Zedek. She is the reporter with I-24 News who broke the now viral story about 40 Israeli babies being murdered by Hamas. She's going to offer us a lens into the horrors that she witnessed and offer more context to her coverage. Let's welcome Nicole to the show. Nicole, you are with I-24 News, and the coverage you've been doing this week on the ground in Israel, it has gone viral. People have seen this coverage all over the world, and you had a report this week that went viral. It stunned a lot of people, and it had to do with a slaughter in which Hamas killed babies. There were 40 babies who were killed, and in the report, the fact is you mentioned that there were IDF soldiers who told you that some of those babies had been decapitated. And it's so horrific to even talk about. And yet here we are having to do that. Let's talk first about what you saw and experienced at that site. Let's just go there. Take us through some of what you saw and experienced and what the soldiers told you.
It was difficult walking through as we were guided by the Israeli military. And this was a scene, a kibbutz community, kibbutz Kfar Aza, that had just been liberated. Within hours, they had just finished fighting Hamas terrorists. So the military, even as we were going through this community, they were still going door to door, house to house, clearing the bodies from this community. There were some houses that we weren't allowed to go near because there were still mines or booby traps that had been placed in there. So we would get near a scene and they would say, you have to step back because that could explode at any moment. As you're walking through these communities, you see destruction everywhere. Not only are bodies still lining these communities, the Israeli military trying to rush ahead of us to cover the Israeli bodies. Meanwhile, Hamas terrorists' bodies, there are dozens of them riddle the former playgrounds and parks and community areas of this kibbutz. But there are also, saw a stroller that was stained with blood, a crib overturned on its side, taken outside of the door. This was in front of the house now. The crib overturned, splattered with blood, a child's toy still inside. So when you're looking at these gruesome, horrific images and hearing from the soldiers firsthand, the deputy commander, one of the first people to arrive at the scene on Saturday, and as he's arriving at the scene with the rest of his troops, actively fighting terrorists, going door to door, actively fighting these Hamas terrorists who infiltrated into the community from maybe a quarter of a mile away from the Gaza Strip. While they're fighting, they're being surrounded by this scene of a massacre. So that was also very difficult for them. And I think it's interesting because people don't realize I'm a journalist, as you said, as you are too. I moved here 8 months ago to cover news in the Middle East, in Israel and the surrounding area. I'm doing my job on the ground. If I was doing this covering a war in Ukraine, let's say, for example, and I was speaking to firsthand witnesses, along with showing the footage of the aftermath, would anyone be doubting these scenes? If I was reporting on this in my own home in the United States, speaking to American soldiers who were first to arrive at the scene, talking about this massacre, along with showing the images of the massacre. So although we're not showing the images of the dead bodies, you see the blood stains, you see the scenes of the attack, and you hear from people who experienced it. So the fact that people are doubting these soldiers,
yeah, it's I mean, you were told this by soldiers. It's interesting to me that the decapitation piece of this is such a sticking point, as though killing 40 babies in some other form would be ever acceptable in any way, right? But the reality is numerous stories, casting doubt that this is unconfirmed. And the way that these stories frame it, and I wanted to get your reaction to this piece of it, is that, oh, well, that at first Israel was saying this happened, but now they're kind of backing away from it. They're not willing to confirm it. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because you were just sort of hinting at maybe why that is, with the images, but just react to that a little for me.
And now, unfortunately, Israel foreign ministry has released some of these images of burnt babies, of babies covered in blood. Now they've released these images as of yesterday. And so I'm wondering why people needed to see this, if the other footage from the ground wasn't enough. And so we do have confirmation from separate Israeli sources. We continue to hear even now from American sources, U.S. Secretary of Defense Antony Blinken saying that he's seen some of these images with his own eyes. And so the fact that this continues to be corroborated, and as you said, the form which they were slaughtered, murdered, and the people that we spoke to on the ground said it was guns, it was knives, it was grenades. So if later it comes out that these soldiers, what they witnessed, they misspoke, and it turns out the baby's head wasn't cut off, it was shot off. This is a dismembered child we're talking about. So the life is lost, and that's what people need to focus on. And also, this is just one community. We continue, as this continues to develop and they continue to go community to community in the South and continue to clear the bodies and recover these communities, we're hearing more horror stories. I heard one story yesterday from one of the people who goes in and clears the bodies. And he said he found a pregnant woman who was shot in the head, her stomach sliced open, the baby still attached to the umbilical cord, and the baby was stabbed with a knife. And he's asking himself, which came first?
Well, Nicole, I appreciate you taking the time, bringing us through this. I'm sorry you're in a position, too, of having to then rehash it and talk about it. But I think it's important that we do discuss that these are things that are happening and that we break these issues down so that people really, as you were just saying, understand the gravity and the horror of what is happening there. And we would love to have you back as this situation unfolds.
Of course, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Billy.
That is such a sobering account of what is happening on the ground in Israel. When we come back, we'll explore the nature of Hamas's beliefs, the group's formation, and what the Bible tells us about what's to come. This is Newsmakers on the CBN News Channel. Welcome back to Newsmakers on the CBN News Channel. For our final segment, we are sitting down with none other than Joel Rosenberg. He's going to break down why he believes Hamas chose this month to wage its deadly terror attack. He'll also detail the terror group's radical ideology. Let's welcome Joel to Newsmakers. Joel, appreciate you joining me. I want to dive right into who Hamas is. A lot of people out there may not realize what Hamas is and what they believe. Can you tell us?
Sure. Well, Hamas is a terrorist organization that is an offshoot of sort of the original radical Islamist terror organization that came out of Egypt in the early 1920s called the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas is their offshoot, and they started in 1987. And their charter, if you read the charter of Hamas, the original charter, it's crystal clear. They want to annihilate, eradicate every Jew in the land of Israel, destroy the land of Israel, the nation state of Israel, and take it over. So it's a genocidal organization. But what's particularly important is not just its genocidal ideology and intent, but the fact that they're funded by the Iranian regime. They are armed by the Iranian regime. They're trained by the Iranian regime, and they're directed by the Iranian regime. They are not people that you can rationally have a conversation with. I want to be clear because one other point connected to it, Billy, Israel doesn't occupy the Gaza Strip. This is Hamas's raison d'etre. You guys are the occupiers, the Zionist occupiers. We haven't had a single soldier or civilian in the Gaza Strip since 2005. So Israel withdrew and said, look, you guys have beachfront property on the Mediterranean. You have trillions of natural cubic feet of natural gas right off your shore. You can build a Palestinian paradise. God bless you. Instead, the Hamas terror organization took over the Gaza Strip, and 2 million Palestinians have been living under their reign of terror, not Israel's, ever since.
This is a whole other can of worms, but, looking at what is going on here and looking at the fact that Russia is dominating headlines as well with Ukraine and all of the other issues that are going on, why is the Iranian-Russian, and this is a loaded question, but relationship something we should pay attention to politically, but also prophetically?
Yeah, well, I've always enjoyed having that conversation with you, Billy, but maybe it's more sobering today than ever. In 2006, I wrote my first nonfiction book called Epicenter about the prophecies related to Israel, but specifically the prophecies of Ezekiel 38 and 39, what Bible scholars call the War of Gog and Magog, where Russia and Iran and other countries will form an alliance against a reconstituted, resurrected geopolitical nation state of Israel in the last days of history. And in my more recent book 2 years ago called Enemies and Allies, where I sat down with Prime Minister Netanyahu and the King of Jordan and the President of Egypt and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and all these top leaders, said, what do they think about who are our enemies and who are our allies 20 years after 9/11? I also talked about the Russian-Iranian alliance, whether you see it as prophetic or not. I do, but that doesn't mean we're quite at the point of the Gog and Magog war. I don't see yet any evidence that this is a trigger. I will say, because since you're interested, I don't bring it up on Fox or
yeah. I love your perspective on this, and we don't get to talk about it a lot, so I am interested.
Well, I will say this. We're in the next 24 hours, it looks like we're going to be in a full-blown biggest invasion of Gaza since 1967. Okay. And it's going to be bloody. If that happens, it will be bloody and bad and painful, and the world media and governments will turn against us for a season. But it could turn out that that's what's needed to help convince all terrorist and militant-minded Palestinians, enough. Israel has won. There's no way forward. Let's find a way to make peace now before more damage is done. You know, Japan is not our enemy today because we fully defeated them. I'm not talking about using nuclear war. I'm not saying that. Germany is our ally today, a challenging ally, but an ally nonetheless, right? Because we defeated them not once but twice. And sometimes a population needs to know our military option is gone. We have lost. Are there benefits to saying we don't like these Israelis, but maybe we should make peace with them? That's what's happening in all these other Arab countries, including Egypt and Jordan and all these others. So if we got to that point, Billy, I would argue we would be extraordinarily close to the prerequisite of Ezekiel 38, which is Israel has to be reconstituted as a country. Jews have to flood back into the land after centuries of exile. Check, check. Israel has to be rebuilding the ancient ruins. Check. Israel has to be prosperous so that's so noticeable that other countries will be interested or envious. Check. And Israelis have to be living securely in the land without walls, gates, and bars. Well, we obviously had a wall with Gaza and they blew it up and stormed through. We have a wall with the Palestinians in the West Bank. So we're not there, but a year from now, 2 years from now, 3, maybe we are there. And then all these other peace treaties break out and people will be thinking, wow, okay, so the Middle East conflict is solved. You and I will know, and we'll be talking about it then. That's wonderful, but there are more chapters in this book.
Well, Joel, as always, appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you for bringing your audience's attention to this. It is Israel's darkest hour, and we needed the light of Christians all over the world to stand with us.
That is incredibly helpful information about Hamas, about Scripture, and especially when it comes to this war of Gog and Magog. A lot to unpack there, and we'll be back with more Newsmakers in just a moment here on the CBN News Channel. That's all for Newsmakers today. Thank you for watching, and be sure to head over to the CBN News YouTube channel. That's where you will find the full interviews that you saw on today's episode. We hope to see you here again on Newsmakers next week.